Chapter 10, The Feast. Voyage with the Vikings. Imagination Station. Come with me to the Longhouse, Leaf said to Patrick. The feast will be held there. Maybe someone took her inside. They ran across the village. The Longhouse was much larger than the church. Patrick stuck his head through the doorway and looked around. The big room was filled with men and women. A gray haze hung like fog. It was hard for Patrick to see. He coughed and wondered what caused the smoke. Then he saw a fire blazing in a ring. It was at the corner of the room. Some of the smoke escaped through a small hole in the roof, but most of the smoke filled the room. No one seemed to notice. Patrick saw a huge metal pot hanging over the fire. He thought it looked like a witch's cauldron. The Norsemen and women sat on the long wooden benches. They ate roasted fish and meat, and they drank from wooden cups. A group of men played bone pipes and wood drums. Young teen boys and girls sang happy songs. Others danced nearby. Patrick moved slowly among the crowd. He reached for Beth. A few men were playing board games. Eric the Red was playing a game against another man. Next to Eric was Hilda. Next to Hilda was Beth. Patrick couldn't believe it. There she was, sitting on a bench. A small crowd moved in to watch Eric and the man play. Beth saw Patrick and came over to him. "What are you doing here?" Patrick asked. "After you left, Hilda came to the church to check on me," Beth whispered. Eric was with her. "What happened?" Patrick asked. "Eric ordered me to help cook," Beth said. "He wants me to learn to be a house slave. That way he can sell me for more money." "But you're not cooking now," Patrick said. "Hilda got upset," Beth said. "Eric isn't afraid of any man, but he's afraid of Hilda. She said she would keep me safe. I've been next to her ever since." "What game is Eric playing?" Patrick asked. "Chess. It's his favorite game," Beth said. "But no one likes to play him." "Why not?" Patrick asked. "Because they're afraid of what he'll do if he loses," she said. Patrick pointed to Eric's sword. The yellow jewel in the handle gleamed. "I think that might be the sunstone, but I wish I could get a closer look." "I wouldn't try," Beth said. Suddenly, Eric slapped the table. Patrick and Beth jumped. The chess pieces bounced around the board. "Checkmate!" he shouted. The man who lost stood up, bowed, and walked away. "Who will play me next?" Eric shouted. No one answered. He stood up and looked around. He saw Patrick. As he stared at Patrick's cape, his eyes narrowed. "Do you play, boy?" Eric asked Patrick. "No, sir," Patrick said. "What about you?" Eric asked Beth. Yes, she said. Patrick was surprised. "You do?" he asked. Beth opened the small sack Mr. Whitaker had given her. She dumped the red and white chess pieces onto the table. Eric picked up the colored pieces. They seemed bright compared to the plain pieces he used. "Sit down," Eric said. "But I don't think I'm good enough to play a grown-up," Beth said. "Sit down," Eric said. It was an order. Beth obeyed and sat across from him. She looked scared. "A wager for our game," Eric said. "If I win, I will get the boy's silver cape." What does she get if she wins?" Patrick said. "You may keep your lives," Eric said. The people in the crowd laughed. Hilda stood up. "That's not fair, my husband," she said. "If she wins, she should get something." Eric groaned. "You are too kind to slaves. What does the girl want?" Beth looked helpless. "I don't know," she said. Patrick cleared his throat loudly. Beth looked at him. Patrick tilted his head toward Eric's sword. "Oh, I know," Beth said. "If you win, you get the silver cape. If I win, I get your sword." The crowd suddenly went quiet. Eric looked puzzled. "My sword?" "Child," Hilda said quite kindly, "that sword is a family treasure." "What would you do with this sword?" Eric said. "It's too big for you." "I would keep it to remember you by," Beth said. Eric smiled. It seemed as if he liked to be liked. Patrick stepped forward. He said to Eric, "If you're afraid you'll lose—" "Lose? I never lose," Eric said. He pounded the table with his fist. He leaned toward Beth. I accept your challenge, he said. Patrick watched as the pieces were arranged. Beth used the white ones. Eric used the red ones. Her hands looked very small compared to the Vikings. The game lasted a long time. Patrick paced. He saw Leif watching them closely. Eric was a smart player, but so was Beth. After an hour, only 9 pieces were left on the board. Beth had 3 pawns, a bishop, and her king. Ooh, he took her queen. Eric had 1 pawn, a rook, his queen, and his king. He still has his queen. She better take that out. Do you guys know how to play chess? I need to teach you. It's so fun. In my critical thinking class, we'll play chess. We can stop now, Eric said to Beth. You can see that I have better pieces than you do. The cape is as good as mine. We'll see, Beth said. Eric picked up his queen. He plunked it down near Beth's queen. Check, he said. Eric then looked at Patrick. Give me the silver cape, boy, he said. Patrick frowned. He began to take off the cape. Wait, Patrick, Beth said. Not so fast. She picked up a pawn. It was the smallest and weakest piece on the board. She moved it 1 space forward. The move blocked Eric's queen. Checkmate, she said. Eric glared at the board. How did you do that? He roared. Hilda laughed. She has also trapped you, she said. With a little pawn. She must have cheated, he shouted. I cannot be beaten by a little girl. The crowd shrank back from him. They were afraid of what he might do. Hilda put a hand on his shoulder. My husband, the girl won fairly, she said calmly. Eric stood up. His face turned a deep red with anger. No, he howled. He pulled his sword out of his holder, arm straight, and held it in the air. His arm started to tremble with rage. Remember your honor, Hilda said softly. Oh, sorry. Remember your honor, Hilda said. I'm sure she didn't scream like that. Remember your honor, Hilda said softly. Bam! Eric threw the sword down on the table. Then he turned and pushed through the crowd. One by one, the Vikings around the game table left. Most of them followed Eric to the fire ring. The musicians began to play again. Beth thought it would feel good to beat Eric, but she felt sad as she put the chess pieces back in her sack. Winning the sword didn't seem right somehow. Leif came over to them. That was a risky thing to do. What will you do with the sword? It isn't for us to keep, Patrick said. Oh, Leif said. He lifted his eyebrow in surprise. I always wanted a sword, Patrick said. And this one is beautiful. He picked it up from the table. It was heavy. He looked at the jewel. Mr. Whitaker would be so pleased to see it. Then he used both hands to slide the sword onto his belt. Hilda came up behind the cousins. She put one hand on each of their shoulders. It's time for us to leave, she said. You have warned the other Christians, Leif asked her. She nodded. Warned them about what? Beth asked. The sacrifices to the gods are about to begin, Hilda replied. Beth and Patrick turned to look at the fire ring. Many of the Viking men and women were now dancing around it. Cups were in their hands. They threw liquid on the fire. What are they doing? Beth asked Leif. They are throwing beer onto the fire, Leif said, as a sacrifice to a false god. The fire hissed and flared. The yellow light cast a strange glow on everything. A deep sadness crossed over Leif's face. My mother is right, he said. This is no place for Christians. Or children. Nope. Not that devil stuff. That's satanic, y'all. But it was what they did back then. But thank goodness God has a way of letting people know about him, doesn't he? Leif took off, came back, telling everybody about God and Christians. Okay, I just reread that. End of chapter 10.